Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. The August 1st deadline for filing 1099 corrections is closer than you think, and missing it could cost your company in IRS penalties. Now, in this episode, I'm breaking down which errors demand immediate correction, which ones may not, and the two options to reduce or avoid unnecessary fines. So, to know exactly what to fix, what to ignore, and how to protect your organization before the deadline hits, keep listening. Welcome to episode 390. Don't miss the August 1st deadline for filing 1099 corrections and 2 ways to avoid IRS penalties. All right, so before I talk about which errors do not require a correction and which errors require a correction, and then how you can avoid penalties, 2 ways to do that, I do want to talk about just very quickly how you even find out about the errors. So we are in, when this podcast is being published, we are in just starting the summer, and summer is a great time to clean the vendor master file. And when you clean your vendor master file, guess what? You're going to find some errors in the vendor master file, either by doing validations and then some validations come back unsuccessful. And in this case, you're talking about doing the IRS 10 match as part of your revalidation process, which should be a part of your cleaning your vendor master file. And those that come back as not matching IRS records, then if you use that name and tax ID on the 1099, now you know you have to file a correction. And so another way that you can find out that there has been an error on the 1099 is if you have returned 1099. So you mailed them out, and when you mailed them out, they turned around and came back because either the address was not good or the address was not formatted for mailing. And so there's a whole process around what you should do when you receive that those or a 1099 back, because you do have to make sure you get it out to the vendor at some point, because the faster you get out to the vendor, the faster they can let you know that there is a problem, if there is a problem, and the faster you can do a correction. And so, and as we're going to talk about the correction, the penalties that are assessed based on when you submit the correction is really based on, again, when you submit the correction. So the faster you submit the correction, the lower the penalty will be. And that means you need the vendor to tell you that there's an issue that maybe you can't discover because they know that it might be an issue. Maybe it's an amount. Maybe you've got duplicate vendors, which is another thing, by the way, that you can find when you clean your vendor master file and realize that you've sent multiple 1099s, right, to the same vendor, or that the other vendor record received the 1099 and maybe they had bad information on it. So cleaning that vendor master file, looking for duplicate vendors, doing those revalidations can be one way to know that you might have filed 1099s with inaccurate information. Also, I talked about receiving those 1099s back. And then the other way is you just get a call from the vendor or the vendor contacts you by email. And so kind of talked about that already, but yes, they can let you know that maybe the amount is wrong, maybe the form is wrong. We used to get a lot of calls about the amounts for the 1099s because everybody always thought the amount they received was less because we had a large population of mom and pops, and so they always took a lot of explaining. Not sure what your vendor population is like, but if you have a lot of individuals, sole proprietors, maybe mom and pops, you probably have the same problem. So one way or another, those are just three ways you're going to identify that there are corrections that need to be made. Now, the key is, though, is that these corrections, if you make them by August 1st, you can avoid some penalties, or you may be able to avoid some penalties. So, we're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about which things require, or which errors on the 1099s require a correction and which ones don't. So, I'm trying to figure out which one to start with. So let's just start with those that do not require a correction. So the first one is if you have a wrong first name. So IRS doesn't really care about that. And if you think about it, when they do the 10 match, they're doing it on the first four significant letters of the corporate name, of the last name. And so they don't really care about the first name. Now, the other thing that does not require a correction is a wrong address. And so that's the vendor data that does not require a correction. There are really two other ways, or one other way, and that's kind of one of the two ways to avoid the IRS penalties. So I'll save it for that one. So let's talk about those things that do require a correction, and that is if you have a wrong last name or tax ID, and you know that that is a requirement of the IRS, uh, that you have to have or file a correct last name, tax ID combination. And when I say last name, I also mean the vendor's name. So, vendor's name, tax ID. That combination has to match IRS records. And if they do not, they do require a correction. And then the next thing is a wrong amount. So that's another thing I just talked about, right? That really you find out from the vendor more often than you find it because the vendor will call in, especially if it's way more than it should be, because they don't want that showing as additional income. And so wrong amount, you definitely have to file that with the IRS because the IRS uses those 1099s to compare to the income that the vendor reports. And so you do want to make sure that that is accurate. The other thing is if you use the wrong form. So if you use the 1099 NEC, to file or to report, let's say, rent payments in maybe box one, you just put it in there, right, instead of in box one on 1099 MISC, then that means you have to file a correction. The next thing is if you enter the amount on the wrong box on the form. And so if you have you file the 1099 MISC and you put, I don't know, rents in other income, box three, well, you have to file a correction for that. Now, for each of these errors that do require a correction, when you file the correction matters because if you've seen, and I'll put a link to the information or the IRS's information return penalties page, but if you've seen that page, you know that the correction or the penalties are based on the date that the correction was filed. And so when you go to that page, and again, a link will be in the show notes, when you go to that page, you will see that it will have a chart and based on the year it was due, and so 2026, up to 30 days late is $60 per form, and that's per form. That is each, I should say, per the IRS's language. It's for each information return that you did not provide correctly on time. And that means their version and also your vendor's version. So up to 30 days late is $60, 31 days late through August 1st is $130. And if you file a correction after August 1st or a correction or the form is not filed at all, that could be $340 per form, so it really jumps up. And then if the IRS just finds you have an intentional disregard, it can jump up double actually to $680 per form. So it really does matter the timing of when that correction comes in. So make sure you're taking those vendor phone calls and you're processing those return 1099s. You should have gotten them back already, but if you know there's a pile somewhere, make sure somebody works that. So the dates matter, and August 1st is a critical date because it is one of the two ways that you may be able to avoid IRS penalties. All right, the first way is what's called safe harbor. And this is if the difference in the dollar amounts that you would need to correct is below a certain amount. And so it's two different ones. So if the difference between the dollar amount that you reported for your vendor's payment or right their income, if that difference is no more than $100, then you don't have to file a correction. And the second one is backup withholding. And so if you reported it incorrectly, but the difference between the reported amount and the actual amount that you need to correct is no more than $25, then you don't have to file that correction. Now, one thing I do want to say is that if the vendor requires a corrected statement for, a difference no more than $100 in the reported income or your payments to the vendor, or, a difference of no more than $25 in the reported withholding, backup withholding for the vendor, then you absolutely have to file a correction and you may be subject to, your company can be subject to, right, the penalties, IRS penalties related to that. So all right, so safe harbor is the first way that you might be able to avoid IRS penalties. The second way is if you file by August 1st, and this was where August 1st is critical, that date. If you file the corrections by August 1st and you have the greater of 10 or a half percent of the total number of 1099 forms that you filed. And so if you filed, let's say, 1,000, 1,000 would only give you 5 forms, or 1,000 times a half percent or 0.005 would only give you 5 forms, for based on that calculation, I should say. So that means that you get 10. Now, if you file 5,000 forms, if you times that by 0.005, that means that you can file up to 25 forms uh, that have errors on them, right? So file the corrections and there will be no penalty. But the key is that you have to file them by August 1st. And so that's a big reason why I'm talking about this. This podcast will be published on June 4th. And so you've got some time that you can clean your vendor master file. You can resolve those vendor calls that you received. You can check for any return 1099s and make sure that you get them cleaned up, you get them resolved, you get them worked, so that if you have corrections, you can determine how many they are, and you might be able to avoid penalties again as long as you file by August 1st. Now, I am going to say here, because I am typically slower in the summer months, this is when I offer the cleaning up of vendor master files. And so if you need some help with cleaning your vendor master files so you can make that August 1st correction deadline, I will put a link to where you can go to my webpage to submit a request for a quota. All right. And the last thing is I am going to put a link to a vendor master file tip of the week, a video on my YouTube channel. I'm going to put already, it's early, but you know what? It's never too early to get it on the calendar. The 2027 dates for filing 1099 NEC, 1099 MISC, and 1042S. So make sure you check that out if you are interested in putting that on your calendar early. And that might be something that you want to do, since it could be different for those folks that filed previous years in fire. IRS has indicated that yes, it will definitely be retired. And so you might have more prep to do, and you definitely then want to be armed with the deadline dates. All right. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 390th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.